Vitruvius was not a professional architect and not particularly theory-minded, but he was observant, and when he looked at representations architects needed to make to design and construct buildings properly, he made useful distinctions that accurately described the different ways of drawing, but also a kind of spooky relation to the traditions of making and using buildings. The first of the three drawing methods he cited was iconography, the plan-style drawing that related more than the others to the fact of a building's placement on the ground, with a sense that there was something to the ground that spoke about graves and foundation rituals. The next two kinds of drawings proceed to add dimensions to the flat plane of iconography. Elevations rise vertically from the plan, still obeying the rule of orthography, the right angle allowing the transfer of measurements on the drawing to the construction site. Next, perspective drawings show how the sun and shadows should work, but measurements can no longer be transferred. The portrayal of the depth dimension sacrifices this utility in order to see what the building will look like at a distance. Iconography is significant because it relates directly to how a building cuts into the earth and how these cuts define earth as a primitive and spiritual ground. The iconographic cut assumes that there is a view from above, and that heaven is looking down on the plan. The plan in this form is like the Nazca lines etched into the deserts of southern Peru. The drawing faces the sky and makes it an optical witness, 180 degrees above to match the 180 degrees of the ground below. The ground plane is thin enough to draw on, but thick enough for burial. Just this one figure ground distinction suggests 5 or possibly 6 other aspects of architectural making and drawing related to a wide range of ethnographical and artistic considerations. The point of having a list of terms that are at first unfamiliar is to get the list to be able to go simultaneously outside to connect to new informative ideas, but also inside itself to work on the ideal symmetry of the terms as a list. Because the terms themselves are about insides and outsides, the scale of the list is not linear but circular. Each term is a check and balance on the other terms. Each sets up a way to cross-check the examples and refine the system. The full list is really too much to take in all at once. Even if you see a familiar term, this could be misleading because each term is adjusted to make sense within the context of the list. The inherited meanings of each allows us to learn from its history. But the job is to connect architecture to psychoanalysis, so the join between the old and new aims to create original insights and interactions. In brief, conatus, cathetus, isomerics, and catograph are different ways of talking about mainly visual phenomenon, so the overlap is instructive, and one term helps us understand another. Tessera introduces temporality of delay and retroaction. It was a token that friends in Roman times would break at parting and join at their reunion. The allegory is about how the accident of the edges broken at the beginning are used to authenticate the reunion because they must join together perfectly. The tessera are a perfect materialization of the relation of chance and necessity. Transience, the only abstract term on the list, refers to the idea of how change is integrated into identity and how a slice taken at any point can represent the whole as a process. The most famous term on the list is number 7, anamorphosis, but it could also be the name for the list as a whole. It is what is going on in each of the terms generically, because each term uses a function of latency. Let's take a look at anamorphosis as it emerged in the 16th century, where scenes were painted on walls in a distorted way so that they would make sense only at a single oblique viewing point. Instead of using perspective to cast 2D shadows in a Euclidean 3-space, the shadows themselves became a space within a space, a perspective within perspective. The single viewing point offered up the images in correct proportion, but the viewing point then became a gateway and a ramp into the new space, the world inside the world, a world that could be paradoxically larger than the one it contained. The ticket to this expansive interior was the way it demanded the viewer find and hold that unique viewpoint. This amounted to a kind of paralysis. But if we look at the way the traditional theater space requires audiences to sit motionless and silent in the darkened auditorium, the principle of paralysis is key to the way the work of art requires motionless and silence, in effect asking the audience to play dead. Without this mortification, the spectators cannot become the collective eye, the heaven that looks down on the ground plane of the work, across which actors and their speeches will make catographic marks. Even though the gaze of the audience is horizontal in the theater, the logic of this looking is vertical, since in every play the audience is able to see the plan of the whole, and expectations create an economy fit into 3 acts. When the curtain rises like the lid of a giant eye, the lids of the audience members shut as if in a dream, and in their dream, things that were latent in everyday life float to the surface. The frozen audience playing dead must be anxious in order to enjoy the play. This anxiety is shaped by the symmetries of the death dream, where the soul wanders away from the body after the point of literal death. Death has 2 moments. The first is literal, biological, but there is a second death that all cultures imagine to exist, as the point where the soul must reach by answering to its shortcomings in life, paying its debts, and coming to terms with the fact of death. Since the ancient Greeks, this design has been formalized as the Thesean labyrinth, a set of folds inside of folds that are simultaneously a figure and a ground, an orthography and iconography. What about psiography? This is the best one. The labyrinth is a building made exclusively for the soul, and the soul is a shadow, so we could say that inside the labyrinth there is only a multiplication of flat images repeated to create confusion and doubt. We get proof of this in the Carnival's famous exhibit, the House of Mirrors, sometimes called Lost in the Fun House, made famous by Charlie Chaplin's film The Circus. The Thesean labyrinth is all about getting in and getting out. Each passageway works as an entry and exit, but if the twists confuse you and you forget which way you were headed in case you take a break, you are in for trouble. The 7 layers we would count visually at the top of the plan are really 14, which the Argentine short story writer Borges would call the proper number of infinity. Infinity for the fact that the 2D space of the labyrinth is a trap, thanks to the fact that you only have yourself to blame for the puzzle of getting lost. As soon as you think about your direction of travel consciously, you are in prison. Consciousness is the name of that prison. There is an unusual and productive coincidence here. The story that Rome was founded by 2 twins, Romulus and Remus, sounds strangely familiar when we talk about a seographic building of mirrors, especially when we find that one twin is obliged to kill the other. In the story of the city, the living and conscious king is linked to a parallel unconscious twin. This doubling function is explained by the line that Romulus plows as an outline of the future city wall. The furrow is not one line, but two. It divides inside from outside at the same time it creates an inside of an outside and an outside of an inside, so that Remus can continue as a death presence within the life of the city. This is the original definition of the catographic cut, a cut that cuts both ways. Its shallowness, its 2D quality, provokes Remus to mock it. Then Romulus reacts to this sacrilege by killing him. But this is not just an emotional response. It's a necessity for every living building to have a dead person protected. Remus was the first sacrifice, killed not out of revenge, but to assure that the living king would have a dead double, and that the two twins would rotate on a regular timetable, renewing the strength and safety of the city walls by repeating the exchange between the living city and its mirror image, a city of the dead. So the theme of fratricide is not just an accidental event, but a structure, the idea of the city, where all three kinds of Vitruvian drawings supply a logic of renewal. What seems to be dramatic events on the surface of history are actually ways of constructing and reinforcing this logic. Ancient stories are often thought to be irrational, but this is because the logic that holds things together is latent, inside events that seem to be chaotic, irrational, or magical in everyday experience. Beneath this experience, the structure is smooth, rational, and effective. An analogy of this contrast of confusion above and harmony below can be found in the line that Romulus plowed as the iconographic drawing of the city plan. It was divided into two lines that were carried into the wall design as a double wall. A thin space called the pomerium allowed priests to circumnavigate the city to renew the wall's spiritual and military defensive powers. Inside this thin space, there was an overlap of the inside onto the outside, and the outside onto the inside, the same kind of spatial folding we found in the Thesean labyrinth. And, like the Thesean labyrinth, directionality played a role. To circle a city in a clockwise direction was positive. The counterclockwise direction would destroy it. Inside the pomerium, the overlap allowed death and life to overlap, anticipating and neutralizing this negative possibility. This condensation of two lines running in opposite directions at the same instant is precisely the definition of a vector in projective geometry. Forms such as the Mobius band, Klein bottle, and crosscap have cuts and twists only when they present themselves in Euclidean space. In their native world with only two dimensions, they are smooth and unbounded. The pomerium, whose projective figure is the torus, is a return to this world of two dimensions, a way of opening the hood of the city and working on its engine. The on-again, off-again cut is essential to divide two territories that differ not just in position, but fundamental nature, such as life and death. This is the meaning of the term isomeric. Death is not simply a cessation of life. It is empowered with a positive force, a logic of its own, just as night is not simply the absence of light, but a full and complete realm, a night space as well as a night time. We need a word like isomeric to talk about the way a thing and its opposite cannot be represented by a continuum, but are isomeric, and that the mark between them must be a catographic cut, which appears and disappears thanks to its status as a part of projective space. The term isomeric comes in handy when we need to understand the puzzling circumstances in historical events that seem to us as sheer cases of magic. Isomerics explains that the magic is magic to us, that there is a latent logic beneath that brings necessity into play. Two stories might help explain this: the little-known tale known as the Injunction of Popilius, and the biblical story of Jesus and the woman accused of adultery. Jesus first. The Jewish intelligentsia, known as the Sanhedrin, confronted Jesus in the temple at Jerusalem with a woman they had convicted of adultery. They hoped to trap Jesus into saying, against the law, that she should be freed. He knelt to the ground and began scribbling a text. This was already a custom among Semitic people of the region, a gesture to buy time when confronted with a problem. But Jesus knew that the trial of the woman had not followed proper procedure. The law required the woman's partner should also be accused. Jesus knew he could win the woman's acquittal on this point, but he did not dare confront the Sanhedrin directly, since their intention was to find a way to condemn him formally and justify his execution. So when he delayed by kneeling to the ground to make a mark that the Bible text identified as catagraphine, he was making a cut into a deep surface, not just scribbling on the ground. He was creating a double line so that the Sanhedrin could read between the lines. He was inside a miniature version of the pomerium, making a double distinction. The less famous case, known as the Injunction of Popilius, is where the Roman council stationed at Alexandria was able to prevent the Syrian king Antiochus from invading Egypt simply by using a wand-like stick to draw a circle around him, and at the same time ask him to read the Roman Senate's decree about its jurisdiction over Egypt. The magic circle wasn't really magic, but its effectiveness seems to be magic, since it cut into the earth in a way that made the king realize that he needed to remember something inside the document Popilius had handed him, and consider any future action in relation to it. The catagraphic circle became an apotrope, a turn-back warning, directed at the Syrian army and saving Egypt. Again, we have the same contrast between seemingly contradictory or magical acts in Euclidean space and a seamless logic hidden below, a logic that gets the job done. The king realized that he would not destroy Egypt. Egypt would destroy him. The catagraphic circle opened up reality to the structural fact hidden below, that his attack would be self-intersecting but non-orienting. Instead of victory, defeat. Again, we have the anamorphosis theme of paralysis brought to bear to defend a territory. Jesus' response to the Sanhedrin's challenge was a remarkable demonstration of the way the catagraphic mark is addressed to the ground and is itself a kind of iconography. It engaged isomerics immediately in the legalistic minds of the Sanhedrin, reminding them that they were not just thinking about stoning a woman, but stoning him, and that a procedural error was standing in the way. As with the Injunction of Popilius, the catagraphic mark brought about a paralysis of those who intended to do evil. Just as in the modern stories of vampires, the monster is held at bay with a ring of holy wafers. The catagraphic cut seeks to isolate and paralyze, and the thin line can do this no matter how thin it is. It's the circling that counts. It doesn't hurt to note that vampires are characterizations of seeography, since they are not reflected in mirrors. By now, the relation of the catagraph to isometrics should be fairly clear. Two spaces ruled by twins who are capable of calibrating something with an impossible contradictory opposite, and a reminder that the opposites will always be attached to each other. In Euclidean space, we will identify this difference with monstrosity, miracles, and magic. But in projective geometry space, there will be nothing in the way of a smooth flow around a finite self-enclosing form. But as humans, we alternate between these two spaces, the 3D and the 2D. We even invent a character, the hero, who has the special privilege, denied to ordinary mortals, of being able to visit the underworld and return. The hero wants to know how things work, so he must visit the place where answers to puzzles are stored.